responsibilities of board officers. So that's the topic for the first section of this meeting, and we do have a couple of topics tonight. And so, to start off, well, let me make sure here. You can speak on anything that's posted for today's meeting. Okay, so Mr. Dale Underbaki, yeah, the first speaker, followed by Abra. How you pronounce it? Abra. How you pronounce the last name? Vina. Okay.
Good afternoon. 3 minutes continues to be a pretty strict boundary, but we'll do our best. I believe the revision of our BEP document and the upcoming rollout of our plan for students at risk for not graduating from high school provides us opportunities to become leaders in educational reform for at-risk learners. We have acknowledged that a student's at-risk status is multifaceted and transcends the boundaries of brick-and-mortar classrooms and traditional academic interventions. Before the beginning of next school year, we will have printouts of all 5th through 12th grade students identified as at risk and needing our help. I am hopeful these lists will also include those students who have lost faith in us and decided to drop out. The viability and integrity of our strategic framework will depend on no one falling through the cracks of our reform initiatives. It will no longer be necessary for us to refer to them collectively as at risk, tier 3, or high flyers. We will know each by name. In my review of the current BEP draft, I continue to find a reactive behavioral mindset overshadowing a proactive commitment to building least restrictive learning environment communities for all. In the interest of time, I'm asking that we consider infusing more of our proactive MTSS language into the supporting positive behavior section and the progressive intervention and discipline sections of the plan. In addition, we need to be more explicit about the critical relationship between academic achievement and personalized futures planning and the impact on adaptive levels of learning behaviors. In the quest to address our district's engagement gap, I am asking for consideration of an action step. It will not require any additional funding or staffing. I am only asking that district leadership take steps to ensure that no family receives their notice of at-risk status in their mailbox. A letter carrying this kind of message to vulnerable people who already know they are at risk needs to be delivered face-to-face and reinforced with evidence of encouragement and support. I am asking the timelines, roles, and responsibilities outlined of our at-risk plan be amended to remove snail mail as a notification option. In addition, I believe these face-to-face interventions should include the sharing of a hard copy of our at-risk plan and a brief review of the contents of the policy. Providing a copy of the at-risk plan will provide tangible evidence of our commitment to intervention. The copy of the plan can be reviewed with family, shared with circles of support, and brought along to school-initiated meetings focused on interventions for a successful future. The outcomes of an at-risk notification session needs to highlight a message that we care about you and we're here for you until you feel you are college, career, and community ready. I am confident the implementation of this action step will result in a collateral benefit for our district and immediate payoffs that will be reflected in next year's quarterly BEP updates. We have been talking about restorative reforms for years and with minimal progress to show for our efforts. Our at-risk plan and BEP need to become the strengthening cords of our tourniquet that stops the hemorrhaging of vulnerable at-risk learners into our communities. In the midst of our current budget deliberations, I can understand concerns about, can we afford this? Based on our most current engagement statistics, I think the bigger question is, can we afford not to? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Abra, followed by Joanne.
Serving on the ad hoc group investigating, examining the use of the educational resource officers in the schools. And the behavior educational plans were brought to our group for review. They're a very small portion of what we're doing, but I was incredibly interested in them as I see the issues regarding the use of educational resource officers to be systematically involved in how we're responding to discipline and the child misbehavior and opportunities for teachable moments and what have you. so I took some time to really review through the BEPs. And I'm also a trained child developmentalist, so I was approaching it with that in mind. And as a result, I have a number of questions and concerns, the majority of which I forwarded to Anna, but I wanted to come here and personally express some of those out loud. Essentially, one of the pieces, and perhaps there is other documentation that is not linked to this, I have a limited understanding of what the policies and procedures are responding to child misbehavior. But the behavior education program, pretty much reads like a program for how to expel a child. When you read through it, the bulk of the document is about graduated isolation and restraints, and the majority of the intervention strategies, 2 through 5, begin with removing the child from the classroom. Now, perhaps you have a document that provides a lot of policy, procedural, and guidance for classroom and other support staff on how to work with students with their disruptive behaviors, but it's not apparent from the documentation in the behavior education plan. And I think that facilitates distrust with the school district, and that there's not much by way of behavior education in that plan. There's more the explicitness of the graduated discipline response, which has its own issues. Also, the 2 plans for the elementary school versus the middle school, high school are alarmingly similar. And perhaps some of that is a reflection of maybe some copying and pasting that was unintended. For example, in the elementary school, there is a policy surrounding arrests. And I am frightened by the idea that anyone could possibly conceive of a misbehavior of an elementary school child being warranting an arrest. And furthermore, a lot of the few distinctions that I could find between the elementary school and the middle school, high school, there were some, I couldn't discern what the developmental milestones you were using to inform the decisions for the different response to children that are 4th through 3rd grade versus 4th and 5th graders, for example, for making a bomb threat or threatening to set off an explosive device without actually possession of one. Starts at a level 2 response for the younger kids, whereas a 4th or 5th grader starts at a higher level response. Similarly, I have the same questions regarding inappropriate touching and or sexual contact. Essentially, from a developmental point of view, a lot of these misbehaviors are signs of a child coping with stress, and a lot of that stress being trauma. And essentially what I'm seeing in the BEP is not a lot of guidance on how to support our students so that even the ones that are bearing disproportionate exposure to trauma and stress are able to achieve their educational outcomes, and rather finding ways to get them out of the school system.
Thank you. Joanne? I guess I should have reminded you all to turn on the green light. You pushed, yeah.
All right, there we go. Hello, everyone. So I'm Joanne Yoke. I'm an MMSD parent of 2 daughters, one at Memorial, one at Jefferson. And though I'm speaking as a parent, my perspective is also informed through my policy work at Wisconsin Family Ties on behalf of children with emotional and behavioral and mental health challenges. And I too am addressing the behavior education plan, although one particular budget item that's being proposed in context of the behavior education plan, and that is the proposal, and I'm going to quote it here, to support students with intensive needs and or a demonstrated pattern of behavioral challenges to achieve academic excellence in their least restrictive setting. By adding 8 to, and then end quote here, but by adding 8 to 10 seats in what appear to be the LEAP and the NEON programs. I think first it's important to acknowledge that despite the repeated use of the term least restrictive settings in the description of this one, these are actually considerably more restrictive settings than the settings they would replace for these children. And second, I would like to refer the board to the restraint and seclusion data for the LEAP Marquette and the LEAP Olson programs. Last year, these measures were used 153 times among 9 students at LEAP Marquette, 435 times among 5 or fewer students at LEAP Olson. That 5 or fewer in the data is redacted there. And in the first semester of this year, by comparison, there have already been over 100 more incidents of restraint at LEAP Olson, LEAP West, than in the entire year last year. These numbers are appalling. Restraint is risky. Restraint is traumatic. It is not educational. It is not therapeutic. And in light of numbers like these, and before we consider just even sending one more student into a situation where this level of restraint is what's being practiced, I do have some significant questions here. What evidence do we have regarding beneficial outcomes for students in these programs? Do the LEAP and NEON programs have a record of academic excellence, in quotes, in practice? I mean, is there data to support this? I mean, that's how we're describing these in the proposal. I'm hoping that the board will decline to add seats to these programs unless two elements are addressed. We should not be expanding these programs when the use of restraint is on the rise in this extreme manner. And we should not be expanding them in absence of compelling evidence that the programs are living up to the language in which the proposal presents them. Thank you for your attention to these
Thank you.
considerations.
Okay, that concludes our public speaking for tonight. And so we'll jump right into our agenda for tonight. The first part of our meeting deals with the role of the board officers. And one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, or we're elected to have this conversation tonight, was because of basically two reasons I can think of, and maybe some board members have others. One is that we do have some new board members, and maybe there's some questions around how board officers should function. Maybe someone may even have some suggestions around how board officers should function. And the second question that I really like to address is the question around decisions of board officers, the decisions that board officers make without input from the board. I really like to address that one starting right off and even first. So tonight we're pretty much going to have more discussion than PowerPoint presentations, and so we have a lot of time for discussions. But before I jump into my continuing explanation or conversation around this topic, anyone have anything you might want to add, Jen, or anyone else? Do you have anything you might want to add at this point? Okay. On the topic of decisions that board officers make without input from the board, when I heard that, I gave some serious thought to it, and I couldn't think of any. I couldn't think of any decisions that board officers make without input from the board. And so, but then today I did think of one. For example, having this meeting. I think that was a board officer's decision because the question was asked about whether or not, the question was asked about decisions that we make without input from the board. So I couldn't think of any. So I'd really like to put it out to the board, because this was expressed by a board member, that if there are decisions that you're aware of that board officers make, that we should be making with input from the board. So I think it's more of a board conversation, because I can't think of any decisions board officers make. Mary, can you think of any offhand that we tend to make without full board input?
I would concur with you that the decisions would be ones mainly with regard to scheduling. I think that's what we spend a lot of time on in the board officers' meetings, as reflected in the notes, is what's the schedule for the upcoming month with regard to work groups, what's the schedule on the longer term with regard to the board and the work groups, and how we're going to fit the issues that are on the table into a cohesive schedule that gets to the decisions that the district needs to be making. So I would think of, and certainly we try to reflect whatever's discussed in those board notes, but I think like James, any things that people have observed or even question other decisions, I think we should discuss those.
Dean?
Yeah, the only thing I can think of, and it really happened kind of recent, and it was kind of a one-off and unusual, I think. is at our on the April board meeting, the full board meeting, we had a special meeting before that, and it happened to be around an expulsion, and there was a question, and then we never really got, I think we should discuss whether or not, if that happens in our April board meeting and we have a special meeting before, should we swear in new members so that they sit in on that meeting, or should we wait for the full meeting? I think that was the one that we left dangling, and we just showed up and without, and you know, a full expulsion was left to 5 of us instead of 7. And I think 7 people discussing this, something as serious as that, is better than 5. So I think that's really the only thing, so I think we should have maybe, if next year we get new people and there's a special meeting, what should we do?
Yeah, and let me address that, because I've had a chance to think about that. I know that that seemed at the time like a board officer's decision, but, and those maybe more in the know than I am can correct me if I'm wrong, but once the election for new board officers is over, I think we have 30 days to swear them in. And so we typically schedule that swearing ceremony at the first board meeting in April. So they were scheduled to be sworn in at that meeting. The expulsion meeting was scheduled ahead of that. So in order for those new members to be part of that expulsion meeting, the board would have had to take an action. So it really wasn't a board officer's decision. The board would have had to take an action to say, okay, let's swear them in so they can participate in that meeting. Because as long as I've been on the board, you swear them in that full board meeting, and that's the way it was scheduled. And so it wasn't so much a board officer's decision. To me, that's a board decision. So we needed to change it to say, let's move that swearing-in ceremony up so they can participate in the expulsion. So, TJ, you're nodding your head, so you're disagreeing.
I'm disagreeing because when we had an informal discussion about that, you said it was your decision. Secondly, scheduling, if scheduling is done by board officers, this could easily have been scheduled for that meeting. But, you looked me in the face and said, this was my decision. If you don't like it, you don't like it. And now you're saying it wasn't your decision. So, you can do what you want, James. You can say what you want, but it would not have taken a board action, which does lead me to a second point, which is that if it would have taken a board action, I believe the role of board officers in a broad sense is to facilitate board governance. And if you were aware of this, and it would have taken board action, then then the board president should facilitate that. And I think that's just kind of the general thing, and that requires communication. That's really all I have to say.
Yeah, okay. But it seems to me that that's still a board decision, because it was on the agenda all month to be, for them to be sworn in at the end of the month. So, I wish I was perfect. I misspoke in that meeting, and when I said it was my decision, it wasn't my decision. And so the fact of the matter is, it was scheduled, and everyone saw it, I think. I don't think it surprised anyone that
We dropped it. Yeah. And then we showed up at the meeting and say, hey, did we ever answer this? And we didn't.
Yeah.
And so, I think going forward, it seems if we're going to swear them in that day, they should be sworn at the next board meeting, which was that one, was the expulsion hearing. So it might be a special meeting about something else.
But we don't
next
always
time.
have an expulsion. We just happen to have one.
It
that
just
time.
happened, yeah.
We just happen to have one. So
we
you-
rarely have
Yeah.
special meetings prior to the full board meeting. It was, like I said, it was just something I think we dropped. And we
But
didn't-
also, we would have to have a discussion amongst the 5 of us and say that this is something we agree, because, maybe some board members wouldn't have agreed that would have been the time for them to start. So we would have to have that discussion. I
didn't
mean, it's
have-
still
yeah.
not taken as a given that we would have done that. And so, but for me, I don't see that as a board officer's decision.
I just think we then and maybe we don't have to make a decision right now on it, but if that happens again next year, we should remember this conversation and
Good luck with
make
trying
a
to remember a year
decision.
from now.
You know, well, I will. And we can be a little bit more proactive and say, hey, we need to decide if,
Yeah.
so I don't, now, again, after reviewing all this stuff, we can't have votes over internets and communication and stuff, so eventually it comes down to you two saying, talking with us and saying, yeah, okay, let's bring them in on this one, or not. Depends on what we have to be more communicative and proactive.
Well, and I think we are. I think we do communicate. I think that in a situation like that, I don't know if it's board officer's role, because I may not agree that that's the place to start a new board member. So it has to come from a board member that feels that that's the place for a
Yeah.
board member to start. And I may not agree that that's the place for them to start. So, but I'm only one vote, so maybe there are enough board members to say, hey, we should do that. But then that has to come up from the board, in my view.
I can
Yeah.
give you I think I might have sent an email, and then on Monday afternoon at 3, I sent another one and say, hey, what did we decide about this? And that's too late. I could have pushed this a little bit more, and I'll remember to do that next time. And a little bit more timely as well. At 3 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, when we're meeting at 5, is not the right time to say, hey, what are we going to decide here? So I'll remember this, but that's the really, I don't know if there are any other decisions either that have been made without more communication. So in this one, it's like, okay, we didn't really fully talk to each other good enough, as far as I'm concerned. And I'll do better next time.
Yeah, and Dean, I think that it does bring up the one issue, as I said, most of the things that I think we talk about are around scheduling, and so when it involves a work group, then those are generally things that then the staff also checks in on who's ever head of that work group to address those scheduling things. But there's no doubt that there's one of, I think, the main areas for board officers is sort of this planning of a schedule that makes sense. And if we want to chew up a lot of board meetings talking about scheduling, we could. But I remembered we discussed also that timing of when would the vote on the health care be. And we're intentional in saying, we think it is important that new board members are voting on that rather than outgoing board members. That vote could have been scheduled previously, but I think we used the input because that topic had come up, but then also to say, let's not make it right then at the board meeting because it'd be the first thing right on their plate. So when could we? So again, that scheduling to move it back a week added into that. So I think we're playing a lot of things like based on what discussion has gone on the board. So I would certainly encourage board members to understand that that scheduling aspect is certainly something that I think requires input if you see things that you are concerned about. And I don't think that there was any intent in any way to not have people be a part of any type of discussion.
Yeah,
I would add something that I've noticed in the past year that we've done that I feel is effective is that when we have, I guess I would say topics that are a bit more maybe controversial, there's more community input around that, I'm really taking time to have the discussion at our meetings to decide whether we're speaking individually as board members or if we're deferring to leadership. I can think with the educational resource officers, you took on that responsibility of communicating, and I felt like that was effective versus having multiple people speaking to all different outlets. I mean, but I think that's something, that's just my opinion, and I think it's important that we continue to have that conversation if we have those topics come up, so that we're not, I mean, I think everyone has an individual voice, that's important, but if there's a time when we come together and we say we have a shared message, that we have the individual leadership sharing that with the community.
A question
TJ?
for Dylan about open meetings. Sorry, Dylan. It's just something that came up when someone else was speaking about scheduling. And if I recall correctly, there are exceptions around scheduling and perhaps agendaing. And if you could, somebody said something about we can't do that via email, and there's some kind of exemptions that I don't fully remember.
So agendizing a meeting versus talking about the topic is one of the exceptions, which plays into our meetings policy. So, right, our meetings policy says regular board meetings are fourth Monday at 6 o'clock, or as the board president schedules them, and I shouldn't say or, right, because the regular meeting can only be moved by the board, or as 3 members ask the clerk. And so us saying, do you want a meeting on Dylan's exemplary work in the district? If 4 of you were to come together, that would not. But then you couldn't say it is so brilliant because of the 100 of things that you would list. So I think that's a really good example. But right, the fact that you want to have a meeting is an exception. And that plays into our meeting policy about 4 members being able to request a meeting to the board clerk. And then the
thought you just said
unilateral
3.
authority of the board president. 4 is what the policy says.
Well, 3 goes to the clerk, which assumes the one of the 3 is not the clerk.
Right, I mean, the 4th could
4
be
people.
the clerk,
Yeah.
right? But 4 people, like a majority of the board or the board president have to want a special meeting.
I'm glad that you asked that question and gave Dylan a chance to answer it, because that's been my experience on the board for these past 4 years, is that board officers helps us look holistically at the whole calendar. In August, as you all know, you help us plan out our topics for the year. We do our best job to kind of pat those down, but then life happens, so every month we have to keep looking at the calendar and massaging it and making sure it holds together. So the board provides us guidance on those issues that come up from month to month. The times where I've seen issues like the one you guys are pointing out, typically, and I remember you doing this, James. The board president will say, hey, the one board member will email and say, hey, we think we should be meeting on this, or I don't know, right, like some special meeting request. And then James will respond and say, hey, are there other people who feel the same way? Let me know. And if there are 4 or more, it gets put on the calendar. I do think we make mistakes sometimes, you know. I think that's a rarity, though. Like, I think very rare. But generally, that's how it's worked, and that's how the board officers' meetings, which are very exciting, generally go down. It's a lot about calendar.
And I just want to clarify my earlier statement because I was looking at it really quick. So it is still a meeting, even if 4 people, but it's not a meeting subject to the public notice requirements if the meeting is solely for the purpose of scheduling business. So that is a lot of double talk there. So, but I don't want to create bad habits around, well, if 4 people could do this, it's just not like you, so it's not, it doesn't have to be an open meeting or a noticed meeting. And we know that meetings can occur in ways other than this, and those are what we have to be aware of, and what Dean was referencing, that conversations over other vehicles.
James, can I make one last
Sure.
point? I think this concept of when kind of final tweak to the calendar happens like that, I do think that they have been the exception. I'd personally like to see that practice continue to be the exception, because we put so much time and energy into planning our board meetings in response to your needs and requests.
Nikki?
Just have a quick question for Dylan, because I had asked this in the email. So what you're saying is, like, at a general meeting, if more than certain number of people, then it would have to be noticed, correct? I just want to make
So
sure.
our general practice is if there is the possibility of even a negative quorum, so 3 of attending a meeting that even on the periphery has anything to do with board business, we end up noticing that meeting and putting the disclaimer that while no board, there may be multiple board members in attendance at that meeting, there is no intention for any board business. Barb probably has it memorized, so we'll go. But essentially, we're saying there are going to be people there. It might look like the board, but they're not doing board business. And so, but that makes our weekly meeting.
And can you request that? Or
So-
how does that work?
So, so our general practice is to figure out if multiple board members are going to be there so that we can be proactive in putting that on. So it's more of, if you know that there is a community event or something else happening, people tend to give Barb a heads up, and she's like, oh, I've got 4 people attending. We're gonna put this blurb because it has to do with school funding. So not directly a board meeting, but something that a board member may be interested
Thank
in,
you.
because they're.
So, especially for our new members, is there anything board officers can do to make things better, easier, smoother for you all? I mean, is there anything that you all could think of that would be helpful to you?
I think, I mean, I probably a lot of, I'm still trying to figure out how this is working. And I would just, I guess, ask, I think scheduling is probably one of the most important things we do. We have our most limited resource is time, and choosing what we discuss here versus not is a critical choice. And so, to the degree that, Nikki and I don't know the whole calendar for the year when things happen or supposed to happen. So just involving us and giving us a heads up, because we don't know what lies ahead or behind. And so I think just probably erring on the side of more communication, particularly with that bird's eye view of what the calendar year looks like, would be helpful for me personally, at least.
I would second that and agree with that, because, I mean, I didn't always know, okay, there's so many people here, or this is scheduled for this, and I didn't quite understand that. I'm still getting the hang of it.
Want to say something here?
I think Jen might be going to make the same point.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, I think one of the things we do at the, generally at the board retreat is actually go through the entire calendar. So you will, as a board member, see all the calendars. It's not something that is determined in board officers and isn't shared with the rest of the board.
Yeah, and one of the things, I always view the job as being more of a facilitator. And so, we try to listen at what board members are saying, and then when we go into board officers, we sort of reflect on that and talk about this is what we think, where we think the board is. It's not rarely, if ever, about what I think is going on. Most of the time not. It's mostly about what's going on with the board, what is it that the board is saying.
Yeah.
And that's typically a lot of what we talk about in board officers. Where is the board's priorities, and on all types of subjects, whether it's a budget or what have you. And so that's sort of how we sort of how the discussions are. Yeah.
I was just going to say I appreciate you raising the topic today. I think it's a very healthy conversation to have, especially with new people coming into a group. And so to the degree that we continue it at the retreat or whatever, I think I appreciate you bringing it up. So.
Yeah. Just one last thing, and this is probably mostly for Nikki and Kate as a reminder. August is when we do the annual planning of the calendar, so that'll be slotted in for August again. And every month we give you have the year-long calendar, which you already have, but we remind you of it you should. So every month we update that and make sure you have a fresh hard copy and an electronic copy, and then we also make sure you guys have the monthly calendar. So we'll do our best to try to keep you organized. We know it's a lot.
Okay. Okay, any final comments on the subject? Seeing none, thanks everyone for their input on this topic, and we'll keep moving. And the next item on the agenda for tonight is the BA Behavior Education Plan. And so tonight is, we plan on seeing what maybe board members have to suggest as we move forward, and to look over some of the suggestions from administration. And we have two of our most knowledgeable BEP people plus coming before us here. And is there anything you'd like to say, Jen, to get us started?
Yeah, I'll just set these guys up. John Harper, who's in charge of student services, is here as well. For Kate and Nikki, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to meet with John yet. And of course, you know Leah Esser from last week. And you know Lisa quite well by now. She's pretty much at this table every single Monday night. I want to thank everyone for your really critical feedback at the board meeting last week on the behavior education plan, our third quarter data, our implementation plan, and the policy changes. We have taken that feedback to heart. In this week's updated version of those materials, we gave you the implementation or action steps updated, kind of calling out what we decided to adjust based on your feedback. We gave you a new version of the policy red line, which I hope captured much of the feedback that you provided us. And we've given you basically some of our best thinking or considerations on possible budget implications. These are really fodder for our meeting tonight. So we're really looking forward to discussing those with you. Our goal for tonight, we really need to leave this table with two things. We need to leave knowing what other policy changes you want us to make before we put together your board packet for Thursday, because you will be voting on the BEP policy changes on Monday. We like to get as much direction as we can possibly get on these possible budget implications. As a reminder to the board, and we'll talk about this next Monday night, we have a nice chunk of change, about $1 million in funding that is not allocated in the current budget, which is good. It gives us a little breathing room. We do need for the board to be prepared to sign off, we hope, on a set of early approvals next Monday. And as we mentioned last week in our budget discussion, those early approvals are necessary when we're hiring people, because we want to be competitive and we want to be able to hire the best candidates. And sometimes there's some urgency around professional development. We need to get stuff going in the summer, for example, that can't wait much later than that. We want to start the school year strong. So I say all that because some of the budget implications for the behavior education plan will likely end up on this early approval list because it's about hiring people, for example. So policy feedback necessary tonight, as much guidance as we can get on your thinking about possible budget implications. At this point, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Leah, who will walk you mainly through the budget document. And then what we're thinking, we'll start with budget, James, and then we'll back into any policy stuff at the end. If that's okay. Budget first, then policy, or do you want to do policy first and then budget? Doesn't matter to us.
Well, does the board have a preference?
Yeah.
Policy driving budget makes more sense to me, but
That's always been.
Okay, let's do policy first then. We're not going to talk too much about what we changed in policy. I think we'll just ask you to go ahead and let us know what you thought about the changes we made, and are there any additional changes you'd like to see before the board packet goes out later this week?
Jen, maybe could I say
Oh,
one
yeah.
thing?
Yeah, go ahead,
One
Leah.
thing just to note, in the final column of this, the policy summary document, we did just make note of our response to the board's conversation and questions last week. Not all of the conversations we had around policy necessarily have specific policy implications from our perspective, but we did want to acknowledge areas where the board brought us concerns or things they wanted addressed, and we have integrated those action steps within our document, our implementation document, should it not be a policy implication. So I just want to make sure that the board knows that all the changes wouldn't necessarily be represented on the red line.
That's great. And I think the document you would want to have in front of you now is likely that grid that shows the policy changes that Leah's just waved in her hand.
Okay, so
I
I'm going to open
remove
it
my
up for
question.
board comments right away for the policy discussion. Unless, so you're
No,
done with
please,
it.
that's
Okay,
great.
so-
I'll just be ready to track.
So any board member like to, Dean?
Nikki, did you want to?
I rescind it.
Okay. Yeah, well, two things. I was struck first by Joanne's, well, by both Joanne's and our friend Dale's comments of the specific recommendation to increase the slots for Neon and Leap without some, little bit more clarification on the practice of what they're doing and the results. I think we need, like to get a little bit more information to address her concern, Joanne's issue. But also, until Dale's comments today, I wasn't really able to put into he found the words that I've been looking for around making this personal to people. It's always about that at school, and in dealing in any program that works with people, is that we have to deliver it personally, and so that people can accept it personally. And I think those specific recommendations he made really crystallized it for me as to how we actually make this personal to people. And I wanted us to consider that, because both these questions led to the same thing, is how we implement this thing. If we do it from a law enforcement and perspective or compliance perspective only, we're missing the point of what this is. We were doing that before we changed to the BEP. It was just code of conduct. You don't do this, or you do this, and this is going to happen to you, and shame on you. That's not what we're trying to get at here. So I think the way we implement it, the professional development that gets used to teach the staff the proper ways of doing this, and just simply the respect that we have to do this with, is the areas that I think Dale gave some great examples of how to do this. And that really resonated with me, and I think that's where I'd like to see more. Now, policies are policies. It's, there are, some that we can tweak and write great words down. It's just, if you take this policy and hammer it over someone's head, it doesn't matter what policy you do. If you do it in a way that's respectful and more personal, they'll get it. And I think that's an area where board discussions can get around what's the right word to use, when we're really more interested in what's the right way to implement this thing. So that's my comments.
Hey, I'm going to just interject for just process check real quick. Dean, I really appreciate your comments, but they're actually leading us more into the budget and implementation discussion as opposed to the policy discussion. Do you want to stick with the policy? First,
You know,
I'm
it's
hearing
so
Dean doesn't have
connected. I
changes
mean,
to the policy.
Sometimes it's hard to.
You could
know,
put out
you can-
both.
you
I mean,
can
we could
talk
go
budget.
around.
I mean, it's so interconnected. I think what I want to do is just have an open conversation
Yeah.
here.
Okay.
And if it's a budget, if we slip in the budget, let's deal with the
All
slippage
right,
in the
all right.
budget. I think we can handle that. We don't have
We
to
can handle that.
compartmentalize these things.
All right, let's
And,
do it.
So I want to just have a conversation here tonight. Board members say what's on their mind, and I think our staff is more than able to deal
We
with it.
can totally deal
Yeah,
with
so
that.
I'd like to
Yeah.
go that way, Nikki.
I would agree with Dean. I also would agree with Mr. Underbaki in that I don't believe if your student is at risk of failing to graduate that it should go in the mail either. I believe that needs to be a personal conversation. First of all, we don't know if that letter even gets there, if the kid intercepts it in between, if it gets lost. It's too important a document to handle to begin with. But also, that's one of those things you really need to do personally and say, what are we going to do? Otherwise, we're going to have parents and students say, okay, it's already happening. There's nothing I can do. It's set in stone. So why bother to try? And I don't want to send that message.
Okay, Kate.
So I've been kind of struggling with how to wrestle with this document, and it's coming from a couple of places. And something actually, Leah, you said last week really resonated with me, which is, I think it was in response to a question around kind of what could we have done differently to roll this out, right? When Jen was nodding, right? Both Jens were nodding, in fact. And so this still feels like discipline to me. And I would love to find a way to shift the conversation to be more reflective of focusing on relationship building in our schools. I mean, I think the first time we chatted, I said, what could we do to make every staff person think not about how can I not suspend this kid, but rather think about how can I infuse love into my day more, right? Like, how do we shift our metrics or our policy to support staff to focus on relationship building and positive, proactive strategies. I don't know what that is. Sharice had an idea of kind of bringing some of that actually into the grid. Right now it's super, the document is kind of split. There's all of the upfront proactive stuff, and then there's the discipline grid, essentially. And so I don't actually have a clue what the way to do that is, but I would love to find a way to make the policy and our focus via metrics, not budget, right? We can talk about that separately. Communicate to our staff that what we care about is relationship building. And yeah, I'll stop talking. I'm dragging.
Yeah. I'd like for you all to maybe jump in at this point because we had our speakers today talk about this point too, that yes, and I agree that we had the code of conduct, which is more punitive, but the last 3 years or so we have moved away and we've been talking about behaviors and how do you improve behaviors. And so could you talk about that a little bit? Because I think what we're hearing is that it's not really obvious in this document and where that, I think we're talking about PBIS and the work around that, and maybe you could talk a couple of minutes on that, because I think that that's really where we've been over the last few years, but maybe it has not been obvious to folks, and that we're actually trying to deal with behaviors and relationships. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, James, for that opportunity. It's my favorite thing to talk about related to this. And so it was listening to the public comments this evening was really interesting, because I think over the course of the last 3 years, every time we've come to the table with refinements, we've looked to have our language be more reflective of our values around inclusion, around restoration, around what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. So lots of those, the general, the tone and tenor as it exists in my head is very much a positive, proactive plan where we are working to ensure that all students staff and their families feel like welcome members of their community, that it's a safe place to be, and that when they are there, they truly belong. And so to that end, much of the work that we're doing, so in the first, 30 pages of that behavior education plan before the grid, is around those positive and proactive supports. So PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, essentially is building that multi-tiered system of support for behavior. So what are our general expectations of students and staff? How do we reinforce those expectations? How do we articulate, reteach, et cetera? So that's one piece. Another piece would be just our general work towards developing a school community that is restored, a school district community and individual schools that really approach kids through that restorative lens. So really working to develop systems and structures where students have voice and choice and are able to truly and authentically be themselves, advocate for their own needs, whether it's emotional, social, safety need, academic. And so we really want that. We want our schools to be truly characterized by that belonging, by being able to make mistakes in a supportive environment. Another huge component of the behavior education is around the interventions necessary in order to support students in shifting their behavior. So if you recall from the plan when it was first developed, and it still lives in there, there is that quote related to if a student can't read, you teach them to read. If they can't swim, you teach them to swim. I'm not sure if that was an example in the quote, but the general thought. And so with behavior, if students do not know the behavior expectations, we teach them. And sometimes we can do that universally through the whole school, and other times it requires an evidence-based intensive intervention with our student services staff. So ultimately, the plan is about teaching and learning, skill building, and supporting students when they don't yet know how to engage in a certain behavior. So those are some of the components, but not all.
Okay, before we open it back up to the floor, John, because one of the questions board members always have is around our alternative programs. What do they look like? What are they doing? And we're seeing some budget information here about expansion. Can you just speak for a minute or two about, how does our current alternatives, or which alternatives really aid in the information that Leah's just talking about, that, where are we working with these kids, and, what are we doing in these alternatives to help in terms of behavior and improvement, learning behavior?
Sure. So let me just say right off the bat that we are extremely supportive of inclusive education. I mean, we're not in the business of just creating alternatives for the sake of alternatives. So I think actually it feels like we're a little bit critiqued often about being slow to move students from their neighborhood home school in the most inclusive environments possible to off-site programs. So at the elementary level, at any given time of the year, we have maybe 20 to 24 students for all of elementary, which is not a very big number. Of the students with disabilities, it's like, 1.7% of the students with disabilities at the elementary level. So it's a pretty small number. So the expansion is not quite, I'm not proposing that we're adding another LEAP site, but here's what we've learned in the last couple of years, is that we actually haven't been able to have each of the alternative programs, the Olson site, the Randall site, and the Marquette site at full strength, because at several points throughout the year we had staff leaving. So we had teachers and assistants leaving each of the programs for various other positions, or left the district and so forth. We've also had several students that have been extremely high needs, and that really we were not able to pair a particular students with a group of other students. That was for behavioral reasons, that was for court orders, that was for other very significant events. And in such case, we had to provide a program outside of and separate from some of our LEAP sites. So the expansion that we're referring to isn't necessarily growing LEAP. What we're doing is we're saying if we were to improve the program, it would be to provide more personalized, individualized programs for extremely high need students who have yet to prove group ready within a LEAP location. So that's really what we're proposing, is that we would add a teacher and an assistant to the elementary level and the middle school level, thereby offering the opportunity that the programs could operate at full strength and provide students who have very, very unique and challenging behaviors and needs to be able to have those in a real personalized manner.
Okay, Nikki had her hand up first, and so we'll go to Nikki, then
I
Anna.
worry on I know we state we use PBIS. I understand that. My problem is, how can we be truly a model of PBIS when we have 435 uses of seclusion and restraint on 9 students? I just don't understand how that could be possible. And if we're not growing the program, why are we adding 8 to 10 seats in the program? If we're adding more people, then wouldn't common sense just dictate we are growing it?
Yeah, so we had new staff at one of our locations, and I actually think that we err on the side of documenting restraint a little bit too much. In other words, if there was ambiguity, then we would document that as I use physical force, I use restraint with a student versus intermittent touch, intermittent guidance of a student. And so we actually did a mid-course correction. I think if we look at the data from the fall compared to the spring, it's actually significantly it's less, I should say. So yes, that's a big number. It was very shocking for many of us to look at that number and say, wow, what's really going on there? But when we actually were on site, we had an administrator there who was on site for several weeks and retrained everyone and was extremely clear about this constitutes restraint and or seclusion. This does not. This is just simple touch, guidance, and teaching. So that answer is really unique to Olson. And again, I'm not necessarily promoting that we need to greatly expand these programs. I'm simply saying that if we wish to provide very personalized programs for very high need students, this is a way to do it. We will pragmatically be ending up doing this next year given the resources, meaning that if a student has great difficulty being in a small group of 8 and there are significant behavior events coming out of there, then we're going to take steps to create their least restrictive environment, which may be a little bit more restrictive and maybe separate. I mean, that's what we're doing now.
Lisa, you want to comment?
I just wanted to add something, first of all, by acknowledging that anytime we see restraint and seclusion data, we know that there's something that's not working on behalf of a child. Their needs are not being met in some way. We were talking about this before we came in today, and we talked about how we really want to look at program improvement of LEAP and NEON and those alternative sites and look at data on a regular basis. We need to do better with that. We were talking about ways of looking at those sites as schools with a school improvement plan, with data and metrics that they're following and being supported with. I think that there's work that we can do, John referred to this, just sort of this recalibrating expectations around how do you serve as an effective LEA? How do you write really good IEP goals that are measurable? How do you create staffing and allocation? We adjust allocation in our schools based on needs of students. I get those requests lots of times during the year. It's interesting. I mean, I think there are ways we could actually be more responsive to our alternative programs based on the needs of students as well. So we were thinking about the approach to these schools. We're trying to think of it not necessarily just in number, because I don't know if we're ready to add actual seats or numbers, but I do think programmatically there are other things that we need to think about and do. We're adding a director of special education, a new person that's going to have a really important role in the organization. We have an opportunity, and it would be really nice to have that new person also supervise these locations and have some metrics and some goals upon which to reflect and make changes should it be necessary.
The other thing that I would add is that a district our size frequently sends students to different facilities and or educational entities, tuitions them out, so to speak. In other words, we would send a student to a residential type program. And so because we're very, very protective and we're committed to inclusive education, we want all of our students within the Madison Metropolitan School District to be provided education within our own facilities. We have a remarkably low number of students that are provided any kind of educational services off-site. Like very, very single digits, less than that. I mean, it's like very, very tiny number, which is very different from many others. So we're opting to provide the best quality education we can with our own staff and our own facilities to the degree that that's possible. And hence the reason for this request.
Anna.
Thanks. I'm wondering, for the folks that are leaving, have you guys ever done any exit interviews around why people are leaving the program and why there's a high turnover rate? 'Cause it might.
Yes, we have. Yep, and we have. There's been a variety of reasons for the departures. Some have been very new teachers, and this was a pretty eye-opening experience. Others left for family reasons, meaning they moved. Others took a different job within our school system because it was an area that they were better suited towards, maybe more experience in elementary, for example, or versus high school versus other positions. So yes, we certainly have looked at that, and we feel like we're going to be incorporating those learnings and understandings into our onboarding and support for next year.
And so I just want to get into some of the policy stuff that I was looking at in the BEP. So one thing is under.
Can we finish with this piece? We're kind of all over the place.
Well, I want to talk about what I want to talk about.
I want board members to talk about what they want to talk about. Yeah.
I've been waiting. Okay. So what I was looking at is under the response 1, 2, 3, and 4. One thing that I'm concerned about is that it's not explicitly stated at the different levels that there will be a full functional behavior analysis administered by qualified staff. It's also mentioned like in the pros section on page 18. There's a paragraph at the end of the page when it says when students demonstrate a pattern of behavior or more significant behaviors, it goes on, it's necessary to examine the function. And then it says when an exclusionary disciplinary action is used, it must be paired with one or more interventions. I think that should be written to say it must be paired with qualified staff conducting a functional behavior analysis as well as one or more interventions deemed appropriate. Because my issue is you really can't start handing out interventions if you haven't figured out what is the function of the student's behavior. And this carries over into the responses because I really think level 2, 3, 4, anytime you're seeing repeat behavior, that's the time when you should have trained staff doing a functional behavior analysis because different people are going to interpret behavior in different ways. But at the end of the day, behavior is communicating something, some unmet need for a student. So policy-wise, I do think we need to make sure that it's explicit about doing that.
Can we pause there really
Sure.
quickly, Anna? What do you guys think about that?
I think at this point it's implied, and so I personally don't have any issue with being a little bit more
Prescriptive, yeah.
Yeah, prescriptive. Just really stating that, really, yeah.
Yeah.
I of course would want to confer with the rest of the behavior
Yeah.
team, just because I don't want to make
I
that
was
decision
thinking
in
the same
isolation.
thing, yeah.
But generally speaking, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But what I would suggest, and maybe you already plan on doing this, is that that suggestion should be submitted so that that change is submitted. That's a policy suggestion change. And so that the board can say, okay, we'd like to go this way. And so let's make sure that the things that we want to see, our policy suggestions are submitted so that the admin can consider them and the board can consider them.
The other thing, I still have some concerns around the added behavior for students that fail to comply with their safety plan. I know I talked about it in the briefing. I think first of all, the language in the glossary is so confusing. I'm confused, and it's like, this is a safety plan, it's this kind of safety plan, but it's not this kind of safety plan, and you wouldn't find it in this safety plan. I think you really might want to create some new language. And I also think it's a little confusing because you're talking about a number of different things in there, and so I really think honing in on what is the behavior that you're getting at. I kind of feel like it has to do with maybe physical unsafe behavior between students, whether it's fighting or if it's threats against a teacher, by the things that you sent. But I think that's very different than if you're talking about maybe a student that's a risk for elopement. Or I think it's very different for a student who's engaging in self-harming behavior. You really could not punish someone for that. So I really would like to see just the language. I don't have the words, how it should be drafted, but really picking apart that and getting at exactly what is the unsafe behavior and really teasing out, getting rid of some of these other, like I said, self-harming behavior, suicidal ideation. I just don't feel like those are appropriate as warranting an out-of-school suspension. And like I said, the safety plan is tricky because it falls into like a behavior support plan. The one that was attached when I asked for follow-up was more like a behavior support plan. It indicates, here's the unsafe behavior, here's what adults need to do, these are the triggers to look for. That's the document that guides adult behavior, not student behavior, so you wouldn't be breaking that. But you would be breaking a contract, which is what I think you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we agree. I mean, that we'll work on that language and adjust.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think just to really note, it's not about health, right? Some of the things examples Anna gave are about students' physical or mental health. It's really about a significant behavioral issue that really requires mitigation in the environment. So we'll make sure to address that. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, so I'm going to weigh in here at this point. And I think I'm probably the outlier on the board because when I think about the last 6 years, when we moved away from the code of conduct, which was largely punitive, and moved to the behavior education plan, where we talk more about teaching kids how to behave and correcting that behavior. The question I have, we ask a lot about how do we know when it's working? But if you flip that question around, you ask, how do we know if it's not working? How do we know if it's not working? And so for me, and I've already stated what my issues are, for example, I do think that for example, I want to get rid of this stigma. I do think we have a stigma about our behaviors in our classrooms. And some of them, obviously all of our schools don't, but we have some behaviors. And how do we improve on that? And the biggest question I ask is, how do we know if the science is working? It's the question of this whole PBIS and, is it working for us? And I wonder if one of the indicators is not the fact that we have this, seem as though this group of kids hovering at tier 3 and they just sort of stay there. And they're repeating and repeating. And it seems as though if it was working in those cases, that they wouldn't be staying at that tier 3. We would be improving those behaviors. And so is that an indicator? And in terms of policy, for example, when you look through the document, if you look at the levels, structurally it seems to me, I'm asking the question, are we actually sort of facilitating those kids staying at tier 3? Because a lot of our levels here, a lot of the infractions stop at level 3. We just sort of stay there. And yeah, we don't want to be punitive, we don't want to suspend and expel, but the way we want to get there is through improving behaviors, right? And I think that's what the whole this whole approach is about. But at the same time, we want to make sure our classrooms are places of learning, and we don't want kids disrupting the classroom. So, did we tip the scale too far one way? Do we need to come back the other way a little bit and be a little more punitive? For example, page 35, when we talk about inappropriate or disruptive behaviors, And this one is basically talking about not cooperating with school rules. And that's, talking about the staff and volunteers. And, the highest level of infraction is level 2. And, but right below it, you got behavior that disrupts instruction and the learning of others, which is really important topic to me, because if you're disrupting the learning of others, that may be the most important thing that we're talking about here, because we don't want our educational, our classrooms disrupted. But that one's at level 3. I think at least both of them, they're almost the same thing. So why is one stopping at level 2 and one at 3? So my suggestion here would be that both of them should be at least level 3. And so, because they seem to be the same thing. And also, all these kids that's clustered at the tier 3 that seem to be doing this repeat offenders. What are we going to do about that? Because, we talk about our alternative, and, we haven't talked about Capital High at all. And so before we leave, I want to talk a little bit about Capital High and talk about whether or not that's a suitable alternative for those we don't seem to be able to correct behaviors on. And like I say, I realize I'm probably the outlier in the bunch, but I'm really at the point where I want to see our behaviors in our schools corrected to the point where we're not talking about all these disruptions going on in some of our classes. And one other thing here, then I'll turn it over to the other board. Well, 2 other things. Page 39, inappropriate language and or expression. Swearing, cursing, and making obscene gestures, level 2 is the maximum. We're hearing about teachers being spoken to very inappropriately. If it's level 2, what is the incentive for them not to do it? At level 2, you're basically, you may get a 1 day of in-school suspension. And I'm not sure what that in-school suspension does, if that's enough incentive. So, like I say, I may be drifting back the other way. And even fighting, for example, level 4, and I don't know if this is progressive, you can comment on that at some point. If a person gets in 3 fights, do they still stay at level 4, for example, 3 or 4 fights if they're fighting continuously? And my last policy question is, I don't see anything in here, or did you all make suggestions yet around cell phone use? Do we have, is cell phone use going to be fitted in the grid somewhere? Because that's one of the real big concerns that I have, is how we're using cell phones in our schools. And so have we thought through, how that may fit in here? And so I would like to see, and maybe I haven't, and maybe I overlooked it. I'd like to see cell phones in here somewhere. Okay, I think if you want to respond a little bit, then TJ's next.
Yeah, I would love for these guys.
At least to respond
let's
to
respond.
some of those policy-related pieces. And Dylan, I think I can do this on my own, but correct me if I'm wrong. So I believe it was last year. Was it last year we added so there was the disrupting in general. And that could be interpreted as disrupting my own learning, and that's not good because I need to be a learner. But it also could extend to disrupting my classmates' learning. And so we added essentially a second layer of code to that, where the first being that it doesn't progress as high when it's just impacting the individual student, but it would progress differently into a more punitive consequence if it's impacting the whole community. The same, I think, is true for swearing. If I can see it correctly in my head, there is a lower level response when you're swearing in the hallway, because you dropped your books and are late for class, versus swearing directly at a teacher and calling a name or using language in a way that makes that environment feel less safe. So that's 2 pieces. And then as it relates to cell phone, the policy doesn't actually call out cell phones specifically, but it calls out, I believe it's the very last behavior in the grid. It's unauthorized use of an electronic device. So that is addressed within policy. And I think more importantly, will need to be addressed in our practice and how we are supporting schools and the expectations we set for kids on the front end. Because we've got some pretty bad habits we've got to undo.
Yeah, that's
I
Yeah.
think I covered.
In fighting.
And fighting.
Fighting doesn't progress beyond level 4.
Yeah. I was just curious if a person gets in 4 or 5 fights, then, so.
Should that be an expellable behavior? Is that what you're asking, James?
Well, should
Because it would be.
Yeah,
At level 5, it's expellable.
If a person is constantly fighting, should it be?
I think that's where, I mean, when we did our analysis for the board last week, we really dug into this small, or much smaller, number of students that have more than one suspension, right? Because to your point, if they're having more than one suspension, something's not working in that scenario. And to Dell's earlier point about individualized, right, personalized support for every child that's getting into repeated, pretty high level behavioral incidents. I mean, level 3 is not inconsequential, right? I mean, you're fighting at school. It's not okay. It's enormously disruptive to everyone. So I think what we're trying to figure out is that, what is the number at high school, you guys?
161 kids
100
had 2 or more
right?
suspensions. 61% of those kids are considered high risk on the early warning system when you comprehensively look at
Right.
all of the indicators in the early warning
Yeah,
system.
so
Out of school suspensions or in school?
Out of school
Out
is
of
considered
school
in
suspension.
that.
That's
Yeah, credit,
right.
attainment, out of school suspension, GPA.
Right. I mean, that's a number, the 60% of that number is certainly something we think we can get our hands around. We know who these kids are. We know them by name. And we actually think it involves a process of working face-to-face with child and family to really think about the environment in which they're going to thrive. I mean, John and the team, I think, did a great job of going back through not just the special ed alternatives, but all of the alternative options. And not that that's the right solution for every child. It might not be. But to consider whether or not, if there was a child that needed another setting, are they available to them? And the good news, I mean, it's both good and bad news, but the good news is those seats are available. So the question that we're asking ourselves now is, well, why aren't they being filled, right? Did we have that conversation and made an intentional decision that those programs weren't right for this particular child? Was the conversation not had, right? And this child is in an environment where they're not successful, and there's something about our process that's breaking down, and they're not getting there. I'm actually quite excited about having a very tangible problem in front of us that we can tackle, that won't require necessarily a ton of new resources, right? It's more about the process of working individually with a child to get them to the place or environment or set of supports that they need to be successful. So I don't know, James. I don't think that this is a problem where I feel like we've got to this is not the right word, so I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say the wrong word. But I think that this is not an instance where we need to go back to an old way of working, right? I think that there's a group of students we can get our hands around. It's my opinion.
Okay, it's on TJ.
I've got about 4 or 5 things, I think, and so I'm trying to keep them all straight here. And I'd like to start out by asking Anna to repeat what she said about the requirement for functional behavior analysis, because I didn't quite catch all of it, and I just want to make sure I have that straight in my head before I ask questions related to it.
Right, so I would just propose that it is explicitly stated in the prose that's prior to it's on page 18 where it talks about what the reaction is, that a functional behavior analysis would be done for a student, so we can think about that.
And prior to which actions, I guess is what I'm trying to.
All right, it's on page 18.
Yeah, I'm on page 18 now.
It's the last paragraph.
Okay, when students demonstrate a pattern of behavior and more significant behaviors are necessary to examine that one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But it says when an exclusionary disciplinary action. I think that's where I'm getting at. When we're moving towards removing students and having to move to exclusionary actions, I would just want to make sure that there's a good understanding of what's causing the behavior.
So an exclusionary action would include any action where a student is removed from a classroom?
Correct.
And who is qualified to do functional behavior analysis?
Psychologists, social workers, some counselors are trained, many nurses are trained, and our special education folks. Generally speaking, program support teachers and special education teachers would have received that.
And how many thousands of exclusionary incidents do we have in a year?
A lot. I would say, however, it's probably better to look at the raw count of students or the students experiencing that big exclusionary discipline, because a functional behavioral assessment would not need to be completed every single time a student engages in behavior. An FBA would be done, completed, and used, monitored, and if we are seeing that a student's behavior support plan that results from that FBA isn't meeting their needs, we would go back and look at that again, but it would not be something that would have to be done every time a student engages in a behavior.
I think I understand and support what Anna was trying to get at. I just want to make sure our language gets at the issue and doesn't generate a lot of paperwork and a lot of busy work.
Yes.
And that the students that we have some kind of, way to do this where we do have professionals because this isn't the work for hobbyists. But we don't have, again, our psychologists, social workers, et cetera's time being spent every time a kid's removed from a class filling out a form.
No.
And so I just wanted to kind of get at that. All right, that was number one. Number two is I want to go to the discussion around the budgetary things, and particularly in relation to LEAP, Neon, and Olin Avenue, and try and first off clarify a few things in my own head. So, where does what's the plan for Pride next year? I guess is kind of the starting spot for this.
Sure. So Pride right now is slated to be in its current location, which is at Hoyt, the Hoyt's building.
Could you?
Pride is like a variant of Neon. When we say Neon, that's like middle school alternatives. Pride has been one of the middle school alternatives, and it stands for, it's like an acronym.
And Pride has 8 to 12
Yes,
seats.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. So
okay, so Pride stays at
yes.
Now what goes to Olin Avenue?
Well, okay, you asked like what's going on with Pride.
Okay,
so
well, okay,
Pride.
We'll stay with Pride for now.
Yes. So one of the understandings that we realized this year was that there are students at the middle school level that we feel like we could do a much better job providing a more therapeutic experience. In other words, these are students who we feel would greatly benefit and actually would need a more therapeutic program versus what they are provided now, which is more in the academic realm with behavior supports. And we're essentially evolving Pride to be a more therapeutic type option for students who really need longer term supports. So remember, our alternatives are sort of, we use that in a very expansive way. Some of our alternatives are very much interventions. A student spends a finite amount of time, then they return to their home school. Some students are going to stay a little bit longer because their needs and their issues are a little bit more long-standing, and we feel like the best way to address that is by a more therapeutic type environment and with specific ongoing supports and mental health services to students. That's what's going on with Pride. So it may actually have a different name. We'll see if the Pride still fits with that, but that's essentially what's going on with that.
It says here, close Pride location, relocate to Olin Avenue.
That's a if. Like if we were to move from there, and I would say that Hoyt is not an optimal learning space for this program. And it's more of a recognition that, remember, that's a multi-use building. We have MSCR activities. We have a variety of individuals from little tiny kids to senior citizens and older folks. And sometimes the two groups aren't a good match. And so we're saying that from an optimal learning environment and a potential win for our folks who frequent Hoyt, moving to Olin Avenue would be a real win. There would be a bit of consolidation in terms of oversight. Remember, that's where our Restore program is located. We're also trying to take advantage of the proximity as it's directly across the parking lot from Steps to Success. It's like a hub of further support. So we're trying to do a number of different things in one fell swoop, like provide a really nice learning space, meet some of the community demands and at Hoyt. So just to kind of settle that area down, we've had a couple of incidents over the course of the last couple of years, and I just want to be cognizant and acknowledge that. And we feel like this would be a win-win in many ways.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand this piece of it.
Yeah.
Pride transitions to being the, quote, therapeutic program,
Correct.
perhaps with the name Pride, perhaps with another name.
Correct.
And it would be preferable to have Pride move from Hoyt to Olin Avenue.
Correct.
And there is no staffing change well, maybe a staffing change, but there's no budgetary staffing change associated with the transition from Pride to therapeutic program.
That's correct.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Just checking. So
Yes.
then the 2 FTE teachers and 1 new FTE SEA and 1 reallocated SEA are all related to the addition of seats to existing Neon and LEAP locations. Is that correct?
Well, that's what I began before. So we have the approximate capacity at the elementary school of about 24 students in our LEAP locations, right? About approximately 8 per site, and there's 3 of them. Similar numbers, maybe a little bit more at the middle school level. By adding another teacher and an assistant, what our idea was to have that individual be providing the very highly individualized program, actually not even at LEAP. It's going to be at potentially, if we move to Olin, that could vacate some other space, maybe at Hoyt, maybe for a single student who needs a very individualized, tailored program to meet their needs. That might be a suitable location, but it's really not expanding LEAP per se. It's meaning that students who are currently at LEAP, who that's actually not working out as well as we thought. Like, that is not meeting their needs. So it's a recognition that some students, a very small number, may need a more individualized, personalized education.
Which is then distinct from both LEAP, from LEAP and the therapeutic program.
Yes, but I guess we are
Exactly.
lumping it together with LEAP and Neon because it would be administered by the same person. The same administrator would oversee the LEAP sites and make ultimately, along with IP teams, about the decision to say who is most appropriate for the LEAP environment, who might need this other intervention or this placement in the event that they would return to LEAP and or eventually to their home school, their neighborhood school.
Okay.
Does that help?
I think I've got it straightened out.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to move on from this for now and hit a couple of actually very quick and easy things, I think. On page 30 I'm in the secondary, it's probably in a similar place in the primary. There is the little sections around bullying and harassment, and I would like to request an addition of language there, and I have to get to this page again, sorry. And the addition is, I just have to get to it. These paper copies are so much easier, you can mark them. Where it says, down, I believe it's in the right column, the new language underlined that says all reports of bullying will be investigated in accordance with Board of Education Policy 4510, anti-bullying. I would request a change to all incidents of bullying will be reported and investigated, should be reported and investigated in accordance with Board of Education Policy. A directive to report incidents of bullying. Similar change to the language around harassment. Harassing behaviors should be reported and handled in accordance with. And I think that from both the survey data with where teachers, students, and other staff members had a misunderstanding, had a wide variety of understandings about what bullying was and what they should do about it. I think directive language that we have policies in place, report it, use these policies, I think is important to moving past that. And especially since we've removed the bullying item in the grid or in the policy. So just, that kind of change directive, report these things and use it. So that's a request. Where am I? I'm trying to get all these things. What does that say? Pride, lead, big picture. I too was struck by Abra's testimony, and that her interpretation that this is a road to expulsion or things like that. And I immediately pulled up a copy of it and got 30 pages of things that there were exclusionary practices mentioned in those 30 pages, but the primary focus was far from exclusion. And then you go down to about page 31, 32, 33, where you have first this grid of responses. And, there was the responses, the intervention responses, and the disciplinary responses. And then you go to the chart itself. And with the chart itself, the disciplinary responses, which are, some of the interventions are acts of exclusion, right? If you're going to have a conference, you're going to be going someplace to have a conference. If you're going to, but in general, it's the disciplinary pieces that are the exclusionary ones, and clearly something about how we're doing this is communicating that, because Abra's not the only person who gets that message. Mm-hmm. Something about how we're presenting this is losing track of the responses, which may have exclusionary aspects of it. It may be, step out into the hallway, go to the buddy room, do that kind of thing. And the interventions, which, again, may involve some exclusion, but the focus is not on exclusion. The focus is on restorative, around support and things like that. And that's getting lost in the communication. Mm-hmm. It could be, people bring expectations. People look at the data and say, well, this must be what this is all about because we are doing all these things. And I think it's probably too late to do radical. I know it's too late to do radical changes to the presentation this year. But in how we communicate this to students and families, I don't think it is too late. Mm-hmm. And I guess part of me would suggest that, and as Anna has said many times too, it's not only, and I think Kate might have said tonight, it's not only how we communicate and present this, it's also, it was Kate who said it tonight, what kind of metrics we're tracking, what we're telling people is important. And, in some sense, by telling people that suspensions are important, we're highlighting the exclusionary aspects of this work. And we're not saying we love them, but we're saying these are the important things. And we're not tracking and highlighting restorative conversations. We're not tracking and highlighting functional behavior analyses. We're not tracking and highlighting, referrals to Journey Mental Health. These are things we're not. And I know that there's an RFP out for some software around MTSS. And I hope that as we evaluate that RFP and in related things, that we find a way to move to tracking and celebrating and calling attention to these other aspects of the work. Because I think that, that's not just community members, it's not just students, it's not just parents, but it's also our staff that are more concerned about keeping suspensions down than they are about helping kids. That's a great overstatement, but they have concern, they spend a half hour figuring out whether to suspend a kid, and then another half an hour figuring out what to do with the kid. When they could spend, if they did or did not suspend him, you could spend a whole hour trying to help the kid, right? That's where we want to get to. So, kind of taking that three different places. One is if there is any kind of tweaks that can be found to change that message in the current version, and I don't think there's anything more than tweaks at this point. Two is the communication plan around this as we go into the fall with our students, our staff, and our family and community members. And then three is long-term with that new software, with the strategic framework update and things like that. Let's look for the metrics that emphasize the positive, not the exclusionary thing. And we have to track the exclusionary stuff too, because you can't just ignore it. So that's the big picture piece. Last piece that I have here on my notes that I can still read, because we are all over the place, is kind of calling attention to the stuff on the two items, and James in some sense called attention to these a little bit already. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I got one more thing before I want to go to this. In terms of the budget things, there is a priority action, I think it's called a priority action, I get a little confused, for welcoming schools. There is there are two budget documents that we received this week, one of which has $270,000 worth of things, and there's another $130,000, probably $125,000 here, and something like that. There's about $500,000. The welcoming schools thing is $200,000. Taking all these pieces together, how would you prioritize these as 1, 2, 3, 4? Adding one position to the Neon Leap thing, the welcoming schools, the 200, adding that position, having space at O&M. I mean, all these things. What's your and you can disagree among yourselves. What's your sense is what's most important?
Yeah. So I would say, TJ, in reference to the priority actions that you've already received information on in terms of the welcoming schools, we do believe that everything on that first priority action list is foundational to the work. So those actions we believe would be essential.
So those would be higher than anything that we've seen that new this week.
So I think that I don't know that I would say higher, TJ. I would say that I would say they're critical to the ongoing work that we're doing. I do think as we look at this, and we've looked at sort of our best thinking at the time, knowing that we do have some work to do. I'll be honest, and I'll say we do have some more work to do to figure out our strategy around additional seats at alternatives. I think that that's completely fair to say, and I appreciate all of your feedback here. We know that the first budgetary piece in here and the estimated costs around the behavior education specialist and PBIS, that's about building that restorative, the whole climate approach, the welcoming school approach. We almost believe that that's really intentional about building the whole school climate and supporting what you guys have all said is important. Building the relationships first, building a welcoming school first. That doesn't, believe it or not, that doesn't just happen in schools. You actually have to really intentionally work on that. So those are very important, I would say on that. I would say
Intervention piece too, and the coordination around intervention.
Yep,
is
and
really critical.
yep, and also the interventions and the coordination around that I think is really important. So I do think those two pieces, TJ, what's in the foundation around welcoming schools and in those foundational priority actions, and this first item on here around PBIS and behavior education specialists are really important to build the foundation. I think that the work around alternatives, we have more to do based on your feedback there as well.
Okay, thank you. And then last thing is that I wanted to call back, and, well, if, this is how it was set up, and I'm just, doing
And I
it.
think it's great. The board members are getting a chance to express
Um,
themselves.
And but
Yeah.
this opens it up to the rest of the board. Is the last thing I have here, which is why I put it to last, which is that we have changes in both language And then we have the restarts, restarts in progressivity around refusing to cooperate and being in the hallway without permission and refusing. And I guess that, I go back to our last meeting when we discussed this, and, we talk about school climate, we talk about what's important, and we talk about respect, our teachers feeling disrespected by our students, and then that disrespect and kind of also is that they feel disrespected by the district because they have no tools to deal with this disrespect, right? That it's okay. The message is that it's okay for students to disrespect teachers and nobody's going to do anything about it. My initial reaction is that I like the restart a lot. But reflecting on how it may or may not influence the climates of our schools with students and teachers and ideas of respect and cooperation makes me now hesitant. I mean, I really did like, and I still kind of lean to it. And so I guess that the restart is one piece, and the other piece is that there's some tweaks around the language in refusing to cooperate. And I don't know if these tweaks are important, but maybe they are, and maybe they're the right tweaks, and maybe they're not. So I guess that since I've heard multiple board members say that this is a core kind of behavior interaction that is important to them, and I've heard multiple staff members, particularly frontline SEAs and teachers, say that these are core interactions that are important to how a school functions. I would like to make sure that we do that we do our best to get both the language right and that we fully consider the consequences of the restarts in this context. So that's a request to other board members to pick up that topic, and also to Leah and John and Lisa and Jen, if you want to speak to anything I said too. So that's how I'm done.
I think we should talk about the restart. I mean, it might be good for you guys to kind of just very quickly remind the board of what TJ is referencing. Only because we are voting on this in a week.
Right.
So this is our chance to discuss it. So, Leah, do you want to take this issue of restart?
Okay, give it a shot. So as a reminder, the behavior education plan progresses throughout a calendar year. So a student's behaviors essentially restart September 1 when they come back to school in the fall. What we are proposing is that the behavior regarding being in the hallway and not returning to class when asked actually have a progressive restart at semester. And this is actually something that has come from our schools, teachers, and administrators, really asking for us to give kids the chance to have a fresh start when the semester changes and they're in new classes, with a recognition that sometimes behaviors are connected to a lack of engagement or a lack of relationship, perhaps failing the course and really feeling hopeless. So there's lots of functions of or reasons why kids aren't fully engaged in the classroom and or following directions. And it was the position of our schools that may be contextualized to their actual schedule, and that it would behoove us to give kids a fresh start at that semester, particularly when we think about classroom engagement, being engaged in the classroom as a learner and as a valued member of that community. Dylan and Sheree, do you think, does that do it? Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you.
That's something we'll have to talk about because I'm not so sure I'm feeling that one. Just so much restart, and I think, my basic question is, have we moved too much to the left on all of this
Well,
stuff?
that's why TJ's raising
And,
it.
and so, but it's going to be Kate, Nikki, and Anna.
I'm going to remember to have my green light on this week. So I wanted to just make two comments. One is just a reflection of our dialogue, because we're still talking about discipline. right? And we are the leaders of the district, and so I think it's a fair question if this group feels that kind of that climate relationship piece of the behavior education plan and or of our schools is kind of belongs here to talk about, then it's on us to have that conversation. And so I would love to find a way to do that. I don't know what the way to do that is in policy. Sharice had a really good idea earlier today, which was to try to incorporate some of that language in the grid. We've talked about where something lands on the grid and whether there's a restart or not, and we get super, super detailed on these tiny choices that impact 100 kids, and that matters. And there's 6,000 students that are participating in our discipline cycle that have a level 1 or higher, right? So we've got a lot of students, and all of those 6,000 students have other students in their rooms who are interacting with this plan at a much lower level, and are interacting with our schools, I think, it's about classroom management, James, right? So I really don't feel like I know what the answer is. I just want to bring us back to that central question of whether first, do we believe that kind of relationship piece needs to be stronger in here, positive relationship piece? Maybe it doesn't, but if it does, how do we do that? And then second, as we transition, not quite yet, sort of transition to the budget conversation, I do think it's worth us thinking about as a group. We have got 150 kids that are in these alternative programs. We've got a lot of other students that are interacting in some way with the behavior education plan. Where are the biggest gaps? What are the pieces of this policy that we feel are the biggest priorities for us to address? And is it the alternative programs for 150 students, so it's less than 0.5% of our student body, or is it something else that impacts climate? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a fair question as we at some point talk about budget. So, and the relationship piece, maybe if it's just me that feels like that's kind of a core value that I would like to be talking about more, then I can lay off, but I just wanted to kind of raise it.
Yeah, and as we, before we end today, I think we all should think about conversations and, maybe writing up, the district will write up what they felt that they've heard, make sure that we write up what we think is important for our proposal so that we can submit those also, and we're going to have to do that in a timely fashion. Nikki?
Just a few things. One, TJ, you're doing great, but instead of saying should be investigated, can we please put it as shall, so that the legal wording, so that way shall being must, is that an investigation must be done. It's not it should be done, because if the bullying, if it's that serious of a problem and we're going to focus on it, then I think we have to investigate it. And I know it's semantics, but that one actually does matter a bit. So I would change the should to shall. The other issue, I'm worried, one, I agree with Kate, the relationship is huge. And I want to include all students, but we still need a less disciplined This isn't a military academy. As much as I want respect, I want people to get along. At the same point, I don't want to focus only on discipline. I don't want to do that every day. I don't think that's saving students. I don't think it's keeping them in. James, I understand what you're saying on respect, but here's my issue, which I had raised one other time, and that's this. How do we define it? And are we going to use teacher discretion on it? Are we going to end up with more kids in trouble because of something a teacher sees as disrespectful? Number one thing you see in criminal justice on disorderly conduct, they talk to me in a disrespectful manner. The problem being is, what does that mean? Because it has a really wide range of options. And I'm afraid if we aren't going to be able to codify that. My last comment, and I know it's a little out of order, but my last comment is the alternative programs in Capitol High and everything. How are we preventing it from becoming a segregated school? And I really do worry about that. Also, I think we have a court case we have to consider, the Olmstead decision, which is the least, in least restrictive environment, that nowhere else, that if you can't just place someone there because there's nowhere else to put them. And the courts have upheld that approach quite frequently, and that does apply to schools, and I do worry about that.
Okay, after Anna speaks, if you all could comment on the training around how we help teachers deal with this whole thing of respect. And is it something that we don't talk about, that we have this big possibility of this whole array of a lot more kids getting caught up in that subjective type thinking that I think Nikki was talking about? Are we training teachers to be able to deal with that? So after
Thank
Anna.
you. Well, I agree with you, Kate and Nikki, and there may be other people too, that I do think an important piece of behavior and the things that we're talking about is rooted in this relationship building and connection. And because of that belief, I get a little apprehensive when we start talking about how we can create sites and service delivery programs that are even more disconnected than we have in our schools. So, I mean, and I understand that we want to keep our students in our school district, but what I don't want to see them is being placed in programs that aren't being successful. So I would just go back to what Joanne expressed early on, is if we're going to be expanding a program, and if we're not going to be expanding those two programs, then I think it may need to be rewritten in the budget, because if what you're getting at is increasing staff to provide off-site instruction for students that aren't successful in LEAP or NEON, that's different than growing LEAP or NEON. So my comment would just be that I wouldn't be in favor of growing LEAP or NEON until we have data to show that they're successful and students are having academic progress. Because at the end of the day, that's what the law says. That's what we're supposed to be providing. It's not, we're going to remove this kid from here because it's too disruptive for wherever they're at. So I would like to see that. I put that request in, and hopefully it'll come out. I do have some behavioral data as well as the seclusion and restraint data, but I also think it's important to look at the academic progress of the students and really looking at, are they more successful in that setting, or were they more successful in the setting that they were coming from, and looking at that. That's our goal. My other thing around budgetary implications, going back to the relationship piece, I would like to see some of the money, whether it's in this $500,000 or some of the other innovative funding, to look at programs that are established, and I'll bring this up and I'll put it in writing. I do feel like there are some programs that we've seen success in our district, really getting at that piece of relationship building and building connections, specifically around circles of support, and looking at funding that so the schools can continue to do that, and looking at whether that's a program that we should be growing, because that's a program that's moving our kids towards feeling more belonging and success at school. So I will bring that, in the next few days. The other area around alternative education, I would be interested to get more information if we looked at truancy data, if we saw any trends, because I know we have one SBA site, school-based alternative, which predominantly works with students that don't have externalizing behaviors. It's more internalizing. And what I found is that kids with internalizing behaviors just don't show up. So if we're seeing kids that are dealing with mental health that aren't coming to school for those reasons, I know we're always quick to create new programs for kids that have externalizing behaviors, because they're pretty good at causing disruptions, but we're not always paying attention to what's happening to our kids that are having internalizing behaviors. And two, I think at a certain point, your internalizing behavior can then become externalized if you're really put in that position. So that's just something looking down the road, if we ever look at truancy, if we find any trends about specific kids that aren't attending school. I think Judge Koval has some data around that we could look at and learn from, but just making sure that we have the programs to also work with kids that aren't engaging. And those are my comments.
Okay, apologize, I saw your hand up. So did you have a comment you want to make?
Yeah. So Student Senate actually had the opportunity to talk about the BP with Dylan in April. So I just wanted to bring up some of the things really quickly that the students wanted to be discussed. So there are three things. The first was alcohol, drugs, and tobacco possession. And students wanted, like when reading through the document, they just thought it was like hard to comprehend, since possession could be with usage, it could be with distribution, and those are really like three separate things. They often are in conjunction, but maybe just separating them out into different categories. So that was the first thing that students wanted to be brought up. The second one was with bullying. In the policy, the anti-bullying policy 4510, the definition is really clear, but students just thought it could be more comprehensible if it was split up into categories for physical bullying and verbal bullying with a subsection for cyberbullying, because students did feel that those pieces of data are segregated when they're shown to the public. Therefore, they should be segregated in the policy because they may have different consequences. And then the last thing, more recently, we didn't discuss it at the meeting, but it was brought up, was the cell phone usage. Let me just pull it up real fast. So then some of the students at East High School, since it's being piloted over there, they're concerned about the gap for students who have data and students who don't have data, and their access to social media, and what that causes on their day, because they aren't sure how the cell phone usage regarding social media will be enforced, so therefore there is a huge gap between students with data and students without data, and they feel that that may lead to seclusion of certain students who don't have access to those social media sites during the day. That's it.
All right, thank you. The next part of the meeting, I want everyone to think about, and you all to think about, if you've gotten what you want and what that gap is, so that we can focus on making sure the administration have what you want as we sort of come down the stretch here. And for board members to think about, how you're going to summarize where you are, have it submitted or get it to them verbally, so that it's in a form that we can vote on it. And I do want your comments on subjectivity, because subjectivity is something we've spoken about for years. So it's not a new subject in here. We've always been concerned about subjectivity with everyone, staff and all, and how do we address that? So before we leave, I want you to talk a little bit about subjectivity, but I'd like to turn it over to Mary. You have a comment.
Well, it's tied to James's question about whether it's subjectivity or we call it unconscious bias. I think the thing that concerns me about this discussion is that we haven't really talked about what our teachers need every single day in the classrooms and in the hallways. And they come into this profession because they want to have relationships, right? No one's coming because they want to just check the boxes or put the kids in front of a computer. And yet the environment isn't always easy, and that it's particularly difficult when you have, whether it's 15 kids or 25 kids, if you have even one child that is really disengaged and could be 3 or 4 grades behind, and their way of being included is being disruptive. That affects the teacher and their ability to do their jobs, their morale, because they want to teach, and it affects the other kids in the classroom. And I'm not sure that in all of this discussion that I have a clear picture of what teachers really need, to whether it's to overcome the biases, whether it's to the dealing with situations that they don't know how to deal with. When we talk about the exclusionary practices and whether they're filling in the type of form and doing the type of assessment, sometimes these are crisis situations. And do we have the things in place that help them not only in the long term, in terms of the training, but the immediate, they need to get back to teaching the classroom, and how do we have what they can handle. So I don't want to lose sight of what's happening in the classroom and what our teachers need to be successful with their students. And I'm as concerned about that as I am concerned about our students and whether they are in the most inclusive environment. I think sometimes we have to realize that being in a high school or a middle school or with 1,500 kids and 30 in your classroom may not be. You may be inclusive, but it's not the environment in which you're thriving. So I also don't know what the answer is, but I'm not feeling like I have a clear picture from the information that we're given, and whether it's things that are working, or classrooms or schools that have really found this. I mean, even circles of support is an exclusionary, right? They're pulling kids out to do that. And so, not saying it's not good, but it's not inclusionary. I don't feel like I have enough information as a board member to really understand what our teachers need in their classrooms, and for how that informs as we talk about policy. We say, well, this language sounds better, or we need more clarification on this. Do we have the things that teachers feel that they need, and our administrators in their classrooms?
And I want to turn that back to administration, because I think that's a question that has to be answered. Do our teachers have what they need? And through our conversations here and the work you all are doing, what would you say about that? What do you have to say about that? Because that's maybe the most important piece. Are our teachers, are they supported to the extent that allow them to be as productive as possible? So what would you all say about that?
So I can start with a piece of the answer, because I attend the teacher advisory with Jen every month, and actually just went through today and called all the themes and the summary feedback from that group of, we had 60 people initially apply for that, and a good number of those folks come every month to the meetings, and we spent 2 or 3 times actually talking about behavior, the behavior education plan, in-school suspension, and bullying to a pretty deep degree. And what came up every time in the themes, even when we just do so what's happening, just what's going on in the field, when you hear from folks. Yeah, what's the word on the street, we find out from them, and it goes in the plus delta. And I was reading through those today, putting together the summaries month by month. Every single time, not even just the times you came or your team came, it was, we want more training around restorative practices. We want more support, setting up our schools to be welcoming. We want it to be offered not just in the summer or on Saturdays, because that's voluntary. We want it also to be during the year. We actually think there are some schools and some teachers that actually that have to go, like it's part of sort of the carrying majority that you get in every school. We want our whole staff trained, and we want sort of some teeth in that too. That came up every single time, and that's why when you asked, or TJ, you asked sort of what was, if you could pick one, sort of what would it be? For me, it wasn't just like a pick one. It was both what's in those foundational actions and this first piece here around the PBIS coaches. That's about delivering professional development, getting into schools. We had envisioned a model where Leah's team could go in and on the schools that are struggling the most around setting up those environments, maybe do a needs analysis, like what's getting in the way, what isn't working, maybe stay at that school for a while, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, get things set up, get them stabilized, and then back out a little bit. So I just wanted to share through the advisory that it did come up every week about support for creating those environments, getting that set up, and options for professional development that are both voluntary and where everyone should go. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my take on this is we never hold back on what we need. We're not like hiding, like we never hold back, and the teacher-student relationship is always at the center of everything we're doing, which is why, I mean, when you look at all of the support that we've put into our work around culture and climate, and student discipline, I mean, it is truly multi-tiered. I mean, we made, right, these continuing long-term investments in the proactive work of positive behavior supports, explicitly teaching students scholarly behaviors. We've invested in explicit teaching of social emotional skills. This is why now when you go to any elementary school in MMSD, you see the days start with a morning meeting where kids are, right, kind of getting themselves ready for the school day. That wasn't the norm even just a few years ago. That is why we invest so much in the mental health work that Leah's team has been doing, and Armando was here last week to highlight some of that. I mean, right, it would take a significantly longer meeting to go back through kind of all of those tiers of support, and it's not like a random assortment of things that we're just trying out. I mean, it's actually a very intentional combination of work that's in play. I think every year we reflect on this to hide. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Because
Yeah.
that sounds good,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
And it is good.
but then how do we get to the point that we just recently got to, and frankly, I think it was almost a little crisis that made it finally say, we have a problem with cell phones in the classroom.
Yeah.
And yet, actually, that's been going on for a long time. Teachers could have, I'm sure they told you, and frankly, it's really uncomfortable and sometimes not even safe to tell the kids to put away the cell phone or try to take it away. So I'm listening, but I'm just like, but if that's all true, why didn't we even talk about, like, we gotta tackle the cell phone thing?
Yeah. Well, I was about to get there. Every year we reflect on what's working and what's not working. And in this last round, we've given you all that we've got. We reflected on that. We realized, wow, we have been not insisting on not just clear parameters around simple things like cell phones, but follow through on those expectations and hallways. But Mary, that's why it's in our plan now. I mean, I don't know. All I can say is we are doing it now, and we've already seen a dramatic improvement. And we are proactive. We do the best we can, and then when problems arise, we also have to be reactive. And I think actually this is evidence that we're reacting quite well. And I'm looking forward to the launch of a stronger year next year with much more clear structures where we insist on the support and guidance and response that's needed on simple things like hallways and cell phones. I'm with you guys on that 1,000%. And that's why we built in this more teacher-based professional development on restorative practice in response to teachers like the teacher advisory group who said, it's great that the student services team is getting this professional development, but I need it. And it's why we're now doing that developmental designs PD year-round as opposed to just in the summer, because some of the teachers, I hate to say it, but a few teachers who may need it most, we couldn't require that they were going to the professional development because it was in summer and on their own time. So, I mean, is it going to be perfect? I guarantee you a year from now we're going to find more things we want to make better, but I think we are onto it. A lot of what I heard tonight, and I was glad, James, thank you for just opening it up and letting people just share what was on their minds. I think a lot of what I heard tonight is going to be really relevant for the 3-year evaluation and long-term implementation discussion we're going to have in August. where David Osher is going to come back and kind of, I hope, provide a third point perspective to what we've accomplished or not accomplished in the last few years. I don't think we're going to be able to rewrite the entire BEP to get at the relationships and positive intervention the way we're all envisioning. I mean, I would like to see that too. We're not going to do that this week. I'm going to just tell you right now, it's not going to happen. But we certainly can have that meeting in August and be prepared to do that in time for the rewrite of the BEP for next year. I think we got what we needed. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay,
James, do you want to?
This is what I like to do as we move towards closure. I still want you to comment on subjectivity because it's something that's been on the table for years. And then make sure you all have what you need. And I want board members to have an opportunity to, if there's something, final comment, but please keep them to short comments and not 10-minute worth of conversation. So subjectivity, and then and make sure let us know if you have what you need or what you need from us, and then board members can have their final says.
Excellent, thank you. And Dylan, if I miss anything, don't hesitate to pop up here. When I think about the concept of subjectivity, and actually when I reflect on TJ's question about the change of that language around refusing refusing to return or refusing to cooperate, including being dishonest. I'll use this as just an illustration because I was actually the member of our team that pushed for that change of language, and here's why. The words refuse and dishonest carry a lot of contextualization, a lot of personal sort of definition, and increases the level of subjectivity. So we're always looking to refine the language in the actual policy to better be a concrete description of a behavior that doesn't include a judgment necessarily. So that's one piece of it. That's little, but I just did want to address that. I think the second the issue of subjectivity is one that over the last 3 years we have been working to address through our behavior education plan consultation sessions, through our monitoring of behavior event data. There was one school, for example, who took their behavior event data, their write-ups of that, removed identifying information, and their SBLT, their school-based leadership team, really interacted with those write-ups to identify vulnerable decision points or places of bias or judgment in language or subjective application of policy. So there's both the policy piece of it, there is the work that schools are doing with their teams, and then there's the work that we're doing to support school teams. So the behavior education consultations, like I mentioned, Charisse and the behavior education team are monitoring on a daily basis, and certainly deeply on a weekly basis, school by school, around different behaviors that occur. We tend to pull more frequently those subjective behaviors or those behaviors that tend to be more socially constructed, so not cooperating, not following directions, reviewing those both through the lens of how could we improve our professional development to mitigate for some of the subjectivity, and how can we support from central office our schools to better define, code, and respond to behaviors. So it remains, it's not we have not fixed that subjectivity yet, but we are on a journey, in a really concrete journey, to use our data to have those conversations. And one of the things that should the board choose to fund this first box of asks, those 2 external PBIS behavior ed specialists, a huge piece of their role would be working side by side with school teams, be it the SBLT or the behavior team, or even just principal, assistant principal, to work through, identify those vulnerable decision points and work to mitigate that subjectivity. So we have started that work. That work is ongoing, and we can continue to help our schools to be reflective and better respond to students' concrete needs as opposed to perceived needs.
Okay, as you all know, I'm not an advocate of the around the table approach. So, Nikki had her hand up, and if board members want to have final comments, we'll stay as we were with show of hands. So, Nikki.
Regarding the cell phone use, I think Maya has an excellent point on the data issue. I work in a courthouse, and very simply, I've gotten around our data rules in 5 seconds because the restrictions on the firewall simply by turning off the Wi-Fi and using my data and have full access. I am technology deficient, to put it mildly. So if I can figure it out in under 5 minutes, a teenager's going to figure it out in about 2. My question is, how do we not create a rich-poor barrier, those who can afford it versus those who can't? Whereas if you have limited data because you can't afford more, you can't use it. But those who can almost get free reign. How do we create a policy like that? If we're going to limit it, how do we make it across the board?
I think I won't respond a ton, but I do want to just reinforce the importance of those pilot sites and why, and the importance of piloting it, Nikki, because that point is not lost on me, and it's something we've discussed before. So we will definitely be looking at that data through that equity lens.
Thank you. Dean?
Yeah. Before anyone got to this table, or before even most of you started working here, Madison School District decided to be an inclusionary school. Maybe TJ knows exactly when we did it, or it might have even happened before Dale started working here. But at some point that was decided, and it was rare. It's still rare. Most of the schools do it, districts do it different. We decided not to years ago, and we really haven't had a discussion about that ever since. And the community seems to support that we continue doing this. However, it doesn't mean we don't set up. What we want to do is deliver education to every student in the least restrictive way. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that everyone's going to stay in the school where you're at, in the classroom. It means we have to do it in the least restrictive way. So that we developed some programs to do that, around that. I don't know if we have it right yet. We run into some problems. We have to address them. So with that in mind, I don't think what you're talking about being an outlier on this is I don't think I disagree with you around some things. I think you're coming from a perspective of we're doing this inclusive, but we're going to set up maybe some programs. We're going to rent some buildings. We're going to have some school. We do that. We're still calling ourselves an inclusive program, and I think they work. At least they should work. But then we see some of these data that represent, pretty outrageous numbers of restraints and things like that. We go, oh, wait a minute, let's rethink this, because whatever is happening, that's certainly not being scored out as least restrictive. That's like way restrictive. So we're gonna have to rethink this. So I don't know if we're alone in this, but we certainly have to make some decisions here at this table. And we're on the right track. Our language has to be right. And what I thought and what I think I'd have to second from what you heard. If we're going to be an inclusive district, it demands that every staff get what they need to be able to do that. And I think you heard it loud and clear. And I think I've heard it as professional development and information given to these folks about how to change increase their skills, how to change the way they confront behavior, and then what they do with it. All of it has to be supported, and we can do a whole lot of professional development for for everybody, and they know all the right things to do. But if the structure isn't there and the resources isn't there to back it up, then we didn't complete the job. So I think we're attempting to get there. I can't be any more specific than that, but renting specific buildings to pull some kids out and do education there is not exclusive. It might be the very least restrictive environment we can get for that kid. There isn't a whole lot of them. There's just a small number of it. But so we're going to have these different responses to a different set of kids, and we should have the right response for each kid. It's, I don't know if we're there yet, but we're trying to get there. And we're going to rely on you all to bring us the right stuff as we try to figure it out too.
All right, everybody's in the queue, so TJ is next.
I thought I was done for the night, but two quick things. One is in response to the cell phone issue. I recognize the inequalities and the inequities of people who have access to full data plans and people who don't, and who had in the past relied upon Wi-Fi. I also think that long-term thinking, that we have to recognize that access to the internet and social media on your phone is not a fundamental right, and that this is a privilege, and that maybe it's a privilege that we should, especially during school hours, that perhaps we should consider out-and-out bans, because this is not an educational activity. It is a social activity, and one that is causing problems, and also creates situations of inequity when we try to control those problems. So I think that we should not take off the table complete bans. The second thing is back to the question of restarts and progressivity. One of the things I'd like to ask Leah and Sharice and your team to think about is on page 35, the behavior that disrupts instruction and learning of other students in the classroom is one of the ones cited for restart. That's one that progresses 1, 2, 3. And perhaps, kind of a compromise position, and I'm not sure about this, I'm just kind of thinking about it, but perhaps a compromise position would be, rather than a total restart, a notch down. That if you had gone to level 3, you go to level 2, you start the second semester at level 2. If you'd gone to level 2, you start the second semester at level 1. If that kind of thing. Just as kind of not a full restart, but all the other behaviors I think that you have identified for restarts only go 1, 2 anyway. So that's not relevant. But I think with this one, that a notch down from 3 to 2 might be worth considering. So that's it.
Kate, then Anna?
So two things, and maybe I'll ask my question first and then I'll say something, but I was just going to ask if you guys could just sort of summarize what you're taking away from this conversation. Okay, great, because I feel like we are a little bit all over the place, and it would be helpful for me to hear what we're saying. So Mary, I've spent a bunch of time in the last couple of weeks asking teachers exactly that question. So, if the magic wand was yours, what would you do? Resources, not resources?
Mine was with behavior, not opening up the whole thing.
Around behavior specifically has been, that's what I've probably talked to 15 staff people. And it's very little, and it's just a single moment in time. I've heard like 35 different things, as one might expect. I've heard professional development, particularly from some of our lower need schools that haven't gotten as much. But more of what I've heard has fit into this category for me of time to have the relationship, because they do want it, and they know that. And so it's been the planning time, the before school time, the after school program, the in-home parent-teacher conference, lots of examples that all sort of fall into the category in my head of time to do that. And so for me, when I kind of look at the budget amendment, my head's in a little bit of a different place than particularly this first line item. And it was around some mixture of all those different things that give the time to do to really honor those two specific people, right? And then, I guess, Jen, you'll do the second part in a bit. Okay, great.
Thank you. Anna?
Sure. Just a final comment in looking at and I know we've talked a lot about the alternative education programs, but I would just go back, and I really want to caution that just because we have students that are at risk and have high needs, I don't want to fall back on the assumption that an alternative placement is what they need, because that may not be what they need. And when I read this document, it sounds to me of 161 students, 100 of them may require an alternative education program. I just think we need to think about that and challenge that thinking, because it's not necessarily true for all those students. And maybe I obviously don't know how you came up with that number of what indicators they fell on, but I think I am actually someone on the side of, I do believe in inclusive education. Research supports it. We have a lot of history in our district. And I personally experienced it firsthand with my own child, who could very well fall into that group. But with the right supports and services and knowledgeable staff, he's very successful in his homeschool. And yes, he gets pulled out for different things, because inclusive education doesn't necessarily mean that a student is in the classroom 100% of the time. But so I just want to continue to challenge us to rise to that expectation that we set around inclusive education.
You
haven't had yours.
I didn't
Yeah,
have my
you
turn.
could-
No,
yeah, okay.
and Anna, I don't disagree. I don't want to say I'm against not at all. I think what I'm interested in is what's working. You know, and to the point that others have already made about Neon or Rise or whatever the program is I certainly wouldn't expand. And in fact, it's good that we had this data come out that says, in fact, there were very concerning things with the programs. But I think we should be accountable to families and students who we put in alternative settings that say, we can say that this is better for your student. We've seen this work, and that we are supporting those programs to be successful so those students thrive. They not only, that it's something that is really helping them.
Okay, I think I'm the last in the queue. I don't want to start bouncing back around, but giving everybody, so I'm going to make an exception and let you get your final comment, then I'll give mine. Yeah.
I agree, Mary, I see your point. Oh, sorry. Mary, I see your point, and I understand your views on inclusion. That makes perfect sense. But I do agree with Anna that I want to look at it. I want to be careful. I do know from a personal level. Everyone knows my story on this board. I've been pretty open on it. I was supposed to be in a segregated school. I was not supposed to be in a public elementary school. And I still managed to get a law degree. I don't want people, because we are out there, and I don't want them limited by that. That's my only comment on that.
Okay, my comments. First a question. Do we still have the pamphlet that you all used to send out around alternatives? It always talked about, it summarized our alternatives, talked about each one of them, but I don't recall seeing that in a while. Are we still doing that? And if so, how regular are we doing that? Because I think that was a good information. The board always got a pamphlet, talked about all of our alternative programs. It listed them, and it wasn't a lot of detail, but it's something that kept us informed about our alternatives, and maybe we should add more details in the pamphlet about our alternative program. But it was a separate pamphlet about 4 or 5 pages long that we would get on a regular, maybe twice a year or something. I haven't seen it in a while. Do we still do that?
Yeah, I think since the transition to Capitol High, not old, but I remember the pamphlet, and there was actually even like that big sheet. But let's find out what we can get for you, James.
One of my proposals is going to be, if we're not doing that, I'd like to see that back in there, because board members always have questions about our alternatives, and so that was a way to keep us informed about our alternative programs. Maybe one of the most seismic things I've heard today was this whole thing about how we communicate, this whole thing about behavior and discipline. You know, we and I may not capture it totally right here, but we talk a lot about the punitive aspects of it, the suspensions and all, but not about some of the better things we're doing in terms of the restorative things and how we communicate that. It's like saying, well, I think what board members were saying is that let's talk more about the positive aspects of this. The suspension and expulsion is still there, but maybe let's change the way we communicate this. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So, it'd be interesting to see what we bring forth in that. I think that whole communication piece is very important. One of the things we still don't talk much about is parent involvement. We have all of these things we talk about, all the restorative stuff, and nowhere in there, and maybe the most important piece that every 10 years running, everyone talks about parent involvement, but we never figure out how do we squeeze parent involvement into all of this stuff. We seem to, if the kid is having a problem, what input does the parent have? Or what are we doing to get the input? That may be the most important piece we have to straightening out this behavior thing is, how do we, each student probably has a parent or as a guardian, how do we factor them in? And for me, that's still the big missing piece of all this is what are we doing with parent involvement? And somehow we have to get this figured into this whole behavior restorative approach is how do we factor parents in? And for me, that's a huge one. One of the things I'll be recommending in September is, and we've talked about this in a little bit, but not here, is I'd like to see board members do unannounced visits. I think we need to see things for ourselves, and I want board members starting in September to do unannounced visits, and we don't have to be a long visit, but administration will make sure that schools know that board members will be sticking their heads in once in a while. We need to stick our heads in these buildings, walk the halls, see if these halls are empty, instead of a totally new approach, because I think we have to be serious about straightening these problems out. And so board members, you're passing by school, you got 15 minutes, take 5 minutes of and walk over down the hall real quick. You got to sign in, acknowledge the fact that you're there, but observe. So when we sit here, we can talk about what we've seen. And so in September, that's one of the things that we recommended that board members do more unannounced visits to schools. We need to see a lot more of this for ourselves. And that doesn't mean going in and disrupting anything. You can walk up and down 3 flights of stairs in a minute or two and make an observation if kids are running around the halls or not. And so, and then you can, be on your way. So I think that's will be an important part of what we start doing in September. So, Jen, I'll turn it over to you in terms of what you
Thank you. I want to give it my best shot. We did let principals know that could be possible already. And I think we communicated with the board a little bit of guidance on unannounced visits. So, we invite you to do so. Help me out, guys. But this is what I generally have. I have kind of a chunk of what I heard tonight that, as I mentioned before, that I think is more relevant to the 3-year discussion we're going to have. I think this issue around general communication, the language that we use in the behavior education plan itself. I think even the metrics issue that TJ mentioned, which I thought was really important. I mean, how do we measure not just things like suspensions, but positive interventions and support and their effectiveness? So I feel like that is a category very relevant to the 3-year plan. When it comes to the immediate policy changes, I think we have some real specifics that we can follow up on, like the safety plan language, like the FBA language. I would welcome whoever had specific recommendations to please send us your thoughts on language. You don't have to do that, but that certainly would be helpful to us. So I don't know. I think we're good on the specific policy changes. I think when it comes to the budget proposal, what I'm taking away is general support. I mean, we wouldn't have put it on the list if we didn't think that it was an important potential budget item. So I'm taking away general support with a big question, though, about the alternatives proposal. And I think we'll have to discuss this, our team, and debrief after today, but I think the general direction that I'm getting is to not expand the programs until we know more about how to make sure that they're effective for the students that they serve, but potentially some support for improving the programs. If there's something that we think we need to improve the existing programs, that's one thing, but we shouldn't be expanding to more seats until we know that this is an effective approach for kids. Is that a fair takeaway?
Yeah.
Yeah? Any?
Yeah,
Tell
I
me-
agree to that to an extent, but I
I'm,
still
I'm,
have
sp-
my.
I'm specifically talking about Neon and Leap, the special ed, not the other alternatives, but the two special ed alternative programs that have budget implications. Okay, good to know. Okay.
Yeah, because I'm still concerned about the logjam at Tier 3 and those kids sitting there and
Yeah.
seemingly not getting better, and being disruptive. So, I think something has to happen there.
Okay.
So,
Okay, but generally, I think if there's disagreement of the board, not full support, it is around the special ed alternative proposal. Is that what you guys heard? Okay. All
So
right.
is that what you guys
Anything
said?
else? Yeah.
What I was trying to communicate is I don't, without looking at some metrics to prove whether those alternative ed programs are being successful, I wouldn't move towards expanding
Expansion.
them. Although, if you're looking to increase, like I said, increase staffing to meet the needs of some specialized offsite, I mean, I'm familiar with what you're talking about. Like, I think that's different.
That's what I heard.
I don't know if you're envisioning it to be different or the same, but that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Move adjournment. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition?
Well, it's just one.
We're adjourned.